Welcome back. All right, so I want to talk about the Winter Classic. I want to talk about the Winter Classic because of I think we can all agree that the way the scheduling was done, odd. And I've seen people saying, hey, the network would have wanted it that way because you don't want to compete with the college football games. All right. That being said, I want to talk about the Winter Classic, and what I see is the continuing erosion of almost anything to do with the Winter Classic, really, comparatively speaking, with where it was. When the Penguins were wearing this jersey, and it was 2008, we were at Ralph Wilson Stadium, and the Buffalo Sabres were hosting the Pittsburgh Penguins. The Sabres were rocking a throwback to their 80s look that they would eventually go back to, of course. And the Pittsburgh Penguins, with this, looked fantastic. And there were 71,217 fans in attendance. It was carried by NBC. It was watched by 3.75 million people in the U.S. It was kind of a big deal. The ratings rivaled the Stanley Cup final, and it was the spectacle. It was seeing players outdoors. It was seeing players in an environment we hadn't seen them in before, and it was Sidney Crosby, exciting young player, and so made every bit of sense in the world that this would be a success. The Buffalo Sabres that year were coming off of having won the President's Trophy in 06 07. They weren't as good in 07 08, but these were two good teams. And the Penguins, of course, would go on to go to the Stanley Cup final in 08. They'd win the Stanley Cup in 09. So that's something to keep in mind, too, is that it was a spectacle. It was a good game. It showcased the star of the league and an up-and-coming team that was going to win a cup soon enough. There's a lot of reason to be excited about this game. 2009, it's at Wrigley Field. Detroit and Chicago. Chicago's on their way up. They're going to win Stanley Cup starting in 2010. And for Detroit, they had just won the Stanley Cup in 08. They'd go back to the final in 09. So you've got two very good teams playing at Wrigley Field. Attendance 40,818. Carried by NBC. Watched by 4.4 million people. So it was a big deal. Big deal. Everybody's watching this. And it is drawing in new fans to watch the game. Now, I had to skip around a little bit. I don't want to go through every single one. I wanted to just highlight ones that I felt like were important to discuss. Starting with 2011, so we skipped 2010, we go right to 2011. Heinz Field hosted this one, so Pittsburgh's at home for this one. Washington, the road team, Ovechkin and Crosby. And there you go. You got Ovechkin on one side, Crosby on the other. And you've got various other big star players for both Washington and Pittsburgh. Washington won the President's Trophy in 2010. The Penguins had won the Cup, of course, in 09. So you've got two very good teams here playing a game that ends up being pretty competitive. 68,111 in attendance. NBC, 4.5 million watched that one. That is the number one most watched in the U.S. amongst the Winter Classics. And I think the NHL would love to get back to numbers half that high. This is a Winter Classic that hasn't cracked 2 million in a while, and we'll get there. But yeah, the 4.5 million. I'm also aware that people have changed the way they watch TV, so TV ratings don't mean as much as they used to. But they definitely still mean something, and I think it does show that interest in the Winter Classic has waned over the years. Now, 2014 was a big one. Playing at a Michigan stadium, Detroit's hosting Toronto, so you're going to get fans from both sides of the border watching. 105,491 fans packed Michigan Stadium. So, huge venue, big game, watched by 4.4 million in the U.S. and 3.8 million in Canada, keeping in mind that Canada, of course, we have, I think it's like, I don't know, 11, 12% of the population of the U.S., something along those lines. But yeah, that was a lot of people in Canada watching that. And Detroit, Toronto, yeah, who doesn't want to watch that? And I think in terms of jerseys, because the Winter Classic jerseys are always looked at and gone over, I think that was the best looking Winter Classic I'd seen. Detroit wearing their reds, Toronto wearing their blues. It looked fantastic, and both their throwback jerseys were nice. Now, 2016, from Gillette Stadium, Montreal and Boston, an old matchup, of course. 67,246 in attendance for this one. NBC carrying it 2.76 million viewers. This is the first time the Winter Classic had below 3 million viewers. But, I mean, it's Boston and Montreal. So that you would think would be a draw. I would imagine, too, I didn't see the Canadian ratings on this one. I was putting this board together. Probably well watched in Canada as well because it is Montreal, but troubling, sure. And then in 2020, the Cotton Bowl, Nashville and Dallas, 85,630 in attendance for this one. This is the last one that NBC carries, 1.96 million viewers. That's it. Now, if your answer is, well, it's Nashville and Dallas, they're not a huge draw, you might be onto something. One thing that I think the NHL has done over recent years is they've been trying to spread it around and give it out to different teams. And I understand fan base is saying, hey, we haven't had one yet. But it has led to teams that I think are less of a draw getting the event. And matchups that fans aren't really totally enamored with being set up here. So it moves to TNT. And in 2022, playing from Target Field, St. Louis and Minnesota, and this was the one that was delayed a full year, right? So the Winter Classic was supposed to be in 2021. We did not have a Winter Classic in 2021. Moves to 2022. 38,519 in attendance. So it's still a good chunk of people there that are in attendance. And on TNT, 1.36 million viewers. TNT is not as watched as NBC, obviously. And the NHL has done everything they can to go with whatever TNT is asking for. That is apparently part of the reason why this year's Winter Classic's on December 31st. But the numbers are definitely not where they used to be, which happens when you go from a network that's carried everywhere to one that isn't necessarily carried everywhere. Then you get from Fenway Park, the Bruins hosting the Penguins in 2023, 39,243 in attendance. The ratings go up a bit, 1.77 million watch that game. It's Pittsburgh, it's Boston. You're going to get Americans to watch that. Those are two of the bigger draws. And then in 2024, Seattle playing Vegas at T-Mobile Park. 47,000. I should change this. See, I see T-Mobile and I think, all right, so Vegas is the home. No. That was in Seattle. That was in Seattle, and I know that because Seattle's not that far from here. See, and then I don't have the logos all spread out right. Just don't watch this part. Don't watch this part. All right. T-Mobile Park, 47,313 in attendance. And TNT, True TV, pulled 1.1 million. That was the extent to which they were able to draw views. And so that's part of the reason why it gets moved to New Year's Eve as well. The idea being, hey, college football, you got these playoffs. Got to avoid that. But they also had St. Louis and Chicago. The Blues missed the playoffs. Chicago's in a rebuild. So, right? You have Chicago fans that are perfectly fine with this team not being good this year and hoping for another top draft pick. So there's that. And so it's we still do not have the ratings. I'm not sure what the ratings are going to look like for it. It was hosted at Wrigley Field, 40,933 in attendance. It was raining at the start of it. The weather wasn't necessarily great in the beginning. And I know it was on TNT. I'm guessing True TV carried it again. But I don't anticipate the ratings being much higher than that 1.1 million, if it's as high. Because you've buried it in amongst 13 games. So going back to what people have been saying. I've seen a lot of, hey, they don't want to go against college football. All right. So you can't have it on the first. So you stick it into a 13-game schedule. Well, they did what they had to do. But that's the thing. I've seen a lot of people point out New Year's Eve is not a holiday. So there were a lot of people that would have been at work that wouldn't have had a chance to watch it. There were a lot of people that did not know that it was on New Year's Eve. So they didn't watch it. And it just makes me feel like, and this is just me, back in 2008, this is an event. This is a spectacle. 2025, it's not. It's genuinely not a spectacle. Like, if you go to the game in person, I'm sure it's great. But we now have stadium games. We have heritage games, not every year, but we do get heritage games. College hockey has started doing outdoor games. The AHL has had outdoor games. There are European leagues that have done outdoor games. The outdoor game back in 2008, completely unique. Hey, look what the National Hockey League's doing. This is different now. So when's the Winter Classic? I don't know. Who's it between? I think it's in Chicago. Great. So they got to get Bedard out there. Right. And Bedard was quiet during that game. Quiet. To where the game itself was so fantastic that one of the top things I keep seeing is, how Nick Foligno fought Braden Shen. It is, I'm not saying that a fight shouldn't be talked about, just it shouldn't be one of the main talking points from Winter Classic. It really shouldn't. The talking points from the Winter Classic should be about said spectacle, should be about how beautiful the game was, should be about how much people enjoyed it, and it's not what it was. I think the NHL would benefit from, and I understand it's going to be in their TV contracts. I know that they can't just drop it. I think dropping it for a few years would be a good idea. I don't think that's going to happen. I don't think the stadium games are going anywhere. But what it means is that, like last year when it draws the 1.1 million, that meant that for the first time, the Winter Classic was not the most watched regular season game in the US. And that is something that we're probably going to see again this year, where it's not the most watched game. So now it's not the most watched game. It's not being carried on a network that people watch as much as NBC, who had it before. And even on NBC, it didn't draw 2 million views in the last game they had. So I really think that the National Hockey League is looking at an event that doesn't really mean a whole lot anymore, not like it did. And I don't think you can recreate what we had back then. You could put the Penguins in this. You could put the Sabres in the Winter Classic they wore back then. It's not going to be the same. It's just not. And I think part of it could very well be the teams they choose. We could have that discussion. The fact that it is a game January 1st or December 31st, and it doesn't mean a lot in the grand scheme of things. And it does not have that same draw. I don't think you can get that back. So with them scheduling to try to pop a rating from last year, I just don't think it made a lot of sense. And you can see here how the numbers have dropped. The fans in attendance has stayed good. You know, if you can get 40,000 fans to watch a hockey game, they're paying a premium price. That's good income for the National Hockey League and for these teams. So I don't begrudge them for doing this, but it just doesn't feel like it's the same. Because as soon as the Winter Classic's done, one of the first things I think is, well, the stadium games are in when? March? So first thought in my brain is, so the stadium games are coming up too, right? So, you know, and I'm thinking right away, like, okay, so I wonder how these are going to measure up. But the stadium games aren't a huge draw either. And so this is where we're at. I've seen people complain about the teams that were involved. I've seen people complain about when the game was held. And all of these complaints we didn't have 15 years ago. The NHL just seemed to have it right. They seemed to have a good idea of which teams to put in there. And it drew a lot of attention, both, you know, in terms of ticket buying as well as viewers on both sides of the border. And now it's just sort of, Like, I would love to see a Winter Classic played in, I don't know, Toronto? Like, a Winter Classic in Toronto could be really, really fun. You could have a Toronto Winter Classic where they're playing against, it doesn't really matter because it'd do well. The funny thing is that it definitely feels like the American viewer for the Winter Classic is more important than the Canadian viewer. Which I think is kind of odd because hockey is just part of the fabric of Canada and you're guaranteed a rating. But I understand. I understand that we get the Heritage Classics instead, and a game between, I don't know, Toronto and Edmonton on January 1st might not be that exciting to some. I think honestly a Toronto Edmonton game on January 1st, I think it'd draw just fine in the States. I think with Austin Matthews and Connor McDavid, I think it would draw just fine. And in case Matthews is injured at the time, you would still have, right now, it would be Nylander, Marner, Tavares, and others. But in the event that, let's just say Tavares and Nylander decide to leave the team as UFAs this summer, they will spend that money and bring in new star players. And Toronto will always be a draw. So I'm kind of surprised that it's proven right here that Toronto can draw in the States. I'm kind of surprised they haven't tried a Toronto-Edmonton matchup for a Winter Classic, because it would work on both sides of the border, and I think it could be really, really solid. But the scheduling as it is just doesn't make a whole lot of sense, and I would not be surprised to see this Winter Classic end up being the first one that draws less than 1 million in terms of ratings on the US side of things. And that just doesn't. And I'll say this too: if I didn't have a channel, if I didn't have all the reviews and previews and everything that I do, I wouldn't have watched the Winter Classic this year. I would have been at work. If I was not the hockey guy, I would have been at work. I wouldn't have had a chance to watch it. It's in the middle of the day, and if I was still the hockey guy, but I didn't do reviews and everything, I don't know if I would have watched it. I would have watched parts of it just to see what happened, just to make sure that the fact it was raining didn't have some sort of negative impact on the game. That's Lake Tahoe flashbacks of please don't let it be slush. But at any rate, let me know your thoughts. What do you think the future is for the Winter Classic? Do you think that the luster's gone? It's not coming back? Because that's kind of where I'm at. I don't know how you get that back for the Winter Classic, and maybe part of it is that the NHL now will do whatever they can. It's not just the scheduling around college football and around anything that might be happening in the U.S. It's it's the fact that the NHL just doesn't seem to have confidence in their product, and it doesn't feel like anybody else does either. That's how I read it. Is that if networks are saying, "Hey, we don't want to go against that," oh, so you're saying this product cannot compete with that product? All right, and so there you go. You have a network that's carrying your product that doesn't believe that it can draw, and of course it won't draw if people don't believe in it, because it's that circular thing the NHL has been doing in the U.S. for as long as I've been watching, and it can be sometimes a bit of a head scratcher for me because I think hockey's the best sport in the world. I don't think there's anything that can measure up to hockey, especially NHL hockey. But that's me. Let me know your thoughts in the comment section below. How would you fix it? I don't think the NHL is going to take any kind of break from the Winter Classic. I think they're just going to keep rolling through, and I think they're going to keep trying to make sure as many different teams get into the Winter Classic as possible, which I understand because there's fan bases that haven't had a chance to watch an outdoor game locally. But it does drive down some of the, I don't know. There's just these unique matchups the NHL could have, and they've been trying to be as fair as possible in recent years, and I don't know. And yet still Chicago gets their fifth. Chicago's lost all five. So I've seen Chicago fans saying, please stop putting us in Winter Classics. So I guess there's a lot of fans that would probably feel that way. But for the National Hockey League, they feel like Chicago's a really big draw. So there you go. Are they? Let me know your thoughts, though, on how to fix the Winter Classic and how to make it feel more unique again. Personally, I think if you had Stadium Series 1 year and Winter Classic the next year, that could help. Just give it that feeling of being something unique and special so that when you're watching it, you feel like you're watching something that's kind of historic, which this one felt like. It felt like this was something historic for the National Hockey League. This was a great feat that they had pulled this off. And now it's just kind of standard. We just kind of watch these updates with, oh, yeah, they got the ice out at Wrigley. Cool. Well, that game will be on in a week. All right, neat. They got 40,000 people in there, a little over 100 more than they got the last time out. They made these changes to the building. That's cool. Fun. It's not the same. But let me know your thoughts. Hit like and subscribe if you haven't done so already. Thank you guys so much for all your support as always. I will talk to you again soon.